Hi, this is Lucy Sullivan interviewing Janet Ghigo on July 11th, 2012. So, Janet, where and when did you receive your credentials, and where do you currently work?
Well, I'll start at the end. I don't currently work because I retired, so that's an easy one. My credentials, I got my EEG registry in October of 1973 at the Southern Society meeting in Little Rock, Arkansas. And that was interesting because it was at that meeting that I met a lot of people like Faye Tyner and Dr. Knott and Dr. Henry and some of the giants in the field. And there I was, a little nothing, and met these people. And then I got my, I have that date, wrote it down for you, I wrote it wrong. My Evoke Potential registry I got in Salt Lake City, and that would have been 1984. Actually, my registry, I might have to check. That was 73 or 74. But in Salt Lake City, it was the second EP registry test that had been given, and it was before they started doing the practicals.
What drew you to EEG and diagnostics?
I learned about EEG. I'd had EEGs before, but I never thought about doing them until I was a student in the Bowman Gray Physician Assistant Program. And the neurology department at that time was one of the departments that was, in an experimental way, setting up that brand new program. I was in the guinea pig class there, and I thought, well, that would be real interesting. Actually, my neurologist told me that they were going to do it and that I should do that because I had been interested in going to medical school but had been turned down for whatever reasons. But they were going to have a specialty in neurology in this PA program. And so I was doing that, and the way it was set up, from August to June or something, we were all in the same didactics together, and then we all went out to our specialties. The problem was that the head of the neurology department was on sabbatical until the end of July, and so they didn't know what to do with me, so they put me in the EEG lab. And that was what got me started on it. And since I was in neurology, I went to all the same lectures that the residents had with the neurologists there, and when they were having their educational things and record reading and stuff. So I spent a bit of time learning a little bit about EEG, so the basics at that time. And then I actually ended up, when I got married, I became physician assistant, and then I got married and moved to Texas, where they hadn't invented physician's assistants yet. And as I was going around looking for jobs, I'd go to the neurologist's office and say, this is my degree, do you need such a person in your office? And they'd say, no, but do you know EEG? At that time, I thought that in order to do EEG, you had to be able to put the electrodes on appropriately, and you had to know how many pages of each montage to run. End of story. That's what I thought EEG was. And I knew I could do that because I'd done that. And I had a job working just as a tech aide, sort of like an LPN on a neuro floor. And then they had an opening in an EEG lab at the Brackenridge Hospital in Texas. And so I got into that position, and I was just very, very fortunate to have a supervisor who would come over and teach me. In fact, that was a good starting point for EEG, but really only the first step on a very, very long journey.
Was EEG a popular specialty when you were starting your career?
I don't really know because, as I said, I just fell into it. I hadn't heard about it particularly. I hadn't heard of there being jobs in EEG except for when I was going to these neurologists and they kept asking it. It seemed like there was a shortage. My registry number is 380, so there weren't a lot of registered techs at the time that I, in fact, finished my registry and was already working in the field. So this was in the early 70s. EEG had been around for a while. ACID had been around by then for almost 15 years. So it was getting on its feet, but was not wildly well known and formal.
Who were your early mentors?
I always list Margaret Schaefer as my primary mentor because she had been working at the University of Iowa, which we all remember was just one of the centers in the U.S. for EEG, and because both Chuck Henry and John Knott were graduate students there and did early work, not in clinical EEG, but just getting the equipment to work and that sort of thing. And Margaret had worked with John for a long time. She'd also worked with Margaret Gordon. And the physician that she worked with in Austin was a graduate of the University of Iowa. And the physicians had encouraged Margaret to move to Austin. It was just one of those wonderful, sort of the stars all lined up just right for me, that Margaret had moved there about a month before she was to start her job, and that was about the time I started in the lab. And the lab was run by the neurologist she was being hired to work for. And I think they told her, we have a problem at Brackenridge. You need to go over there. And before you start your real job, why don't you go see if you can sort that out? And that was just absolutely wonderful because she would come over and she'd bring me educational materials. She was active. She was, I think, the secretary of ABRED at the time or something, very active in both ASSET and ABRED and had been in EEG education all her life. So it was just an incredible experience to have her come over to help me. And then I worked with John Knott after I left Texas. I went to Boston, and John Knott happened to have left Iowa at that time and was also in Boston, so I got to work with him a couple of years, and that was very inspirational.
What were your earliest career influences?
Well, I think my patients were in a large point, and I may describe this in some other question that you have, but just talking to patients who were having EEGs, who needed EEGs, who were getting something of value to them in their life from the EEG results. That was a real influence there. And then I also had the opportunity to, because my husband's job kept moving and we went different places. Each place I moved to, there were different specialties that were starting, and so I was able to learn from the people that were there. So I would list a wonderful collection of colleagues as being my career influences, because as I say, when I was at Brackenridge and then later at Seton Hospital in Austin, we were doing just basic EEG and bedside and that sort of thing, but there wasn't much else that was done with EEG. But then when I moved to Boston and was at Tufts, that was when I first learned neonatal EEG. There was a huge neonatal unit there. Of course, Boston Children's was there. There were a lot of people around that knew about neonatal EEG. Cesar Amboso and his techs were doing talks. So I learned that there. Kathy McPeck, I guess she's Kathy Principi now. She was at Tufts, and she showed me the ropes of doing intraoperative monitoring of endarterectomies, which we did at Tufts. And at that time, that was before evoked potentials were actually clinically done. But those were some really good influences. Maria Gabriel was a tremendous influence. I worked with her in Boston, and she was an inspiration just from the way she had come up through the field and become very, very successful about it. And Joanne Simser was another wonderful person that I worked with. She was, when I first was working in Minneapolis, she was still in charge of her training program at Anoka. And I did some classroom teaching with her. I had some teaching courses through Anoka in order to work with them. We did some wonderful educational projects together. And then I also was a clinical instructor for her. So that was wonderful. And then, of course, at Minnesota was the time that Evoked Potentials came into clinical field. At one point, we had just one tech there who was in research lab. She did all of that, and then she got married and left, and so that was all dumped on me. And it was just a terrific experience to be able to learn from somebody who had been doing those for a long time. That was Lana Westfall Pazinski, and learned from her and Dr. Torres about evoked potentials, and we developed the interoperative evoked potentials there. We did, Dr. Torres worked with the epilepsy unit there, so we were doing corticography at that time. So that was a 7-year period that was just incredible as far as learning all of these different new techniques and what could be done with the physiology and technology.
If you had not become an EEG technologist, what would you have liked to have done?
I think the way I was headed at the time, I could have been a physician assistant in charge of an epilepsy clinic or something, because I'd like to have done something with epilepsy in some way, and my training was to do that. I did have an opportunity when I finished PA school to have a job with one of the people who had been chief resident at Bowman Gray, and he offered me a job, and he was going to teach me to do EMGs. But I didn't really have I couldn't take that job because I was planning to get married and move out of state, so that didn't work out. But I think I'd like to have gotten more into the epilepsy field, even from that point of view. And I did the PA program before the comprehensive epilepsy programs were being started. Those were started in the early 70s, about the time I was starting in EEG. So I think that would have been a really interesting direction to go.
Why do you think this field took off when and how it did?
I think the comprehensive epilepsy programs helped by demonstrating things that could be learned by recording for longer, recording under different circumstances. And then I think a huge thing was that when we went from our analog to digital technology. Since the digital technology, there was a lot of new research in things that could be done. Obviously, the digital technology allowed us to record frequencies that were faster than the old pens could move. We were recording places besides through the scalp, which of course changed the frequencies that we could record. So I think there was a lot of new research. And then as soon as you develop a technique like evoked potentials on how to record things with new technology, then you are also looking for a new clinical application for that technology. And I think if you have, those things don't happen all at once. They're a gradual thing. You get the technology, and you have to do the research to find out what you can do with that. And then you discover you can measure things you could never measure before. And then you think, now, what good would this do me? How could this help patients? And I think that we've just been very fortunate to, those of us who stretch across from say, the 1970s, when we had no digital technology, to the present. It's been an amazing, whatever that is, 40 years of just looking at changes in what we were able to measure and how we were able to apply those things.
What equipment did you train on, and what were the main limitations of it?
My first machine was a Grass Model 6 with 8 channels. And the main limitation was that you could only see a limited part of the brain at any one point in time. In a way, I thought it had the advantage in that you had to always be thinking about, there's that one thing in that 1 or 2 channels, but I can't see the rest of that area of the brain. I wonder what the rest of the area nearby is doing. So you had to be making up montages, not just using routine preset montages. You were making up montages so that you could demonstrate things. Is this something that would be better shown on a referential or bipolar montage? would it be good to, if I've only got 8 channels, maybe I could, if it's only in a very small area, maybe I could have a montage that's localizing it with 4 bipolar montages and then giving me a really good picture of the morphology of the abnormality by doing the other 4 channels with a referential montage. And so it was a lot of fun, but it also meant that there was a lot that was missed because there was whatever was going on in the rest of the brain that I couldn't see at that time. So I think that was the primary limitation. That's what I would say. When we got to more channels, you could see more things.
What other equipment have you used over the years, and could you summarize the pros and cons of each?
Well, I had Grass 6s. I had 8 channels. I had talked to actually. We had a 10 channel, but then when that Grass 18 channel came out, those were very nice. And I was always, you're always more comfortable with what you're used to. I've always been very, very fond of the Grass technology. The Grass equipment was just very solid, very reliable. Other labs where I worked, where we had a variety of machines, if we had one machine that had to go to the bedside and was going to have to bump into an elevator and out of an elevator and around corners and up and down, we always would have a Grass machine that was for that because we knew that would stand it. It was going to be working when we got to the bedside. I've also found Grass machines, the old Grass machines were wonderful teaching tools because you were visually turning knobs to turn things up and down, and it related at that time more to what people of that era were used to doing in making changes, so you could see that. I have worked on Beckman machines. They worked. We always had a little bit more trouble with, I've only had one machine that I worked on, so I wouldn't want to speak for the whole group. They were the people that had the first amplifier and headbox, which was a really good pro for those. But they had this tendency to build up electricity as the paper went across them. They had silver switches that would build up silver chloride residue, and so the switches didn't work all the time. And everyone who has been in EEG for any time remembers the purple ink of the Beckman machines. And I'll tell you a funny story about the Beckman machines, and that's that when I had that machine, I was working at the VA in Boston, and at that lab, we had the same number of techs as we had labs and machines, and then we'd switch, so we weren't always on the same machine, but so each week we'd switch machines. But on Friday afternoon, we didn't book any patients in. I mean, it was the VA. They could stay there for a long time if they needed to at the time. And somehow it seemed as if the Fridays that I had my season tickets to the Boston Opera were always the Fridays that I had to wash the Beckman machine. And that was before we wore gloves for everything also. So the only time I wore gloves was actually when I put on my white gloves that I had left over from high school years so I could go to the opera to hide my purple fingernails. So that was my primary Beckman experience. But I used that machine. It was fine. We had neon coding machines at Minnesota. Those were good machines, and these were the early neon coding. And so I've not worked with the modern technology.
What memories do you have of your training?
Well, my training was OJT. I had the opportunity in my PA training to get a lot of the didactics of anatomy, physiology, and that sort of thing. So that stuff I knew, but everything about how the equipment works and all of that I had to learn later. But Margaret Schaefer, she brought me all the materials that she had from Asset, from the various courses that they'd had, and I think I had a very old textbook at one time. But one of my primary memory is of Margaret just sitting at the machine with me. That was just so incredibly important when I was first doing it, because no one had ever shown me how you see the abnormalities as they occur and then make machine changes in order to see them better. When I'd first learned EEG, we were, as I said, we were in one of those modes where you do 10 pages of this montage and then 20 pages of that montage, but you didn't really look at it. We didn't do technical reports. And then when I was sitting with the physicians reviewing the records, it was all just static. They'd look at these 2 pages and they'd say, well, this is page is normal, but there's a little something here. But there was nothing moving. And it was just so incredibly helpful to me to have Margaret sitting right next to me as the record was running. And then she'd point out, oh, you see that little slow stuff right there. And at the beginning, she could suggest changes I might want to make, or later she would, well, what would you want to make a change? And I was able to, at that time, once she'd pointed out to me, oh, there it is, I could go ahead and do those things like changing filters and paper speeds or whatever to bring things out. And this was something that I think it was so important to me that I continued to do that when I became a clinical instructor. It just seemed like it was really good when I was with students that I think it's very important that you have a tech sitting with the students, especially when they're first doing records. And at the moment something happens, you point it out to them. And then they make the change, and then they see right now what happens when they make the change. And it just, I think it's just something that sticks with you much better than having just seen static pictures or looking at it later, knowing that that you are part of this process. I think that was part of that whole teaching method, that this record doesn't run itself. You can't turn the machine on and then go out and hook up your next patient. You have to be right there and be actively involved with your record throughout. And unless you understand where every wave came from, you're not finished with the record. So I think that was one of the best things there. The rest of my training was just studying for boards and that sort of thing.
What are the main ways in which the field has changed over your career?
Well, I think the primary thing that has happened is that there have been better and more available imaging techniques developed. When I first started in EEG, there was no CT, there was no MRI. We did have nuclear brain scanning, and actually the nuclear brain scan lab was right next to my EEG lab at Brackenridge, and I used to talk to that tech when we were free. And I think pictures are easier for people to interpret, just because as we grow up, we see pictures. We don't have any experience growing up looking at lines moving by or interpreting moving objects so much as static things. But I think there was fear at one point that all these imaging things were gonna displace EEG, and I think in some ways they did. For example, we used to, when I first started, we would do EEGs for stroke, even though there were other physicians, neurologists, that said there's no point in getting an EEG for stroke. I can see clinically what's going on, so I don't need to know electrically what's happening. And there was a lot of truth in that, and the same was true of, we used to do a lot of evoked potentials for the early diagnosis of MS, and as soon as MRI came along, that just disappeared. But I think the whole field has done a pretty good job of emphasizing the fact that EEG is looking at function, and all of the imaging studies are looking at structure, and making this differentiation. The two do go well together, but sometimes you can have a structural change that makes a physiologic difference. Sometimes the structural difference does not make a physiologic difference. Sometimes you can have a physiologic problem with perfect structure. And so I think we need to try to make sure that people keep this distinction there. So I think that's the way the field has changed, just because we've had to find new uses for the technology that we had.
How has scientific knowledge changed the field, and what do you think were the big breakthroughs?
Well, and this ties to the ways the field had changed in a lot of ways. I think the primary change was the analog to digital change in technology when we were able to do digital analysis and recording, because that allowed us to record frequencies that were much, much faster. There was a lot of information up there that we never could see before. And so I think that's going to be, that's the main thing, because I don't know that we've learned that much more about anatomy and physiology. We have learned more just from doing EEGs and studies in, for example, defining the different types of epilepsy. And if you think about the different times that international epilepsy groups have come out with definitions of types of epilepsy, and then as the various medications were developed, discovering that, it really does make a difference what kind of EEG you have as to what kind of medication you take for your epilepsy. Or it really does make a difference if you know that this is or is not an epileptic seizure, whether or not we're going to put you on medication. So I think that's been a big breakthrough. But the digital stuff also was what allowed us to do evoke potentials. And once the equipment was better, then people were thinking of new ways of using it. So that was when we moved into the operating room doing things besides carotid endarterectomies with EEG or electrocorticography with the EEG, being able to record the integrity of both peripheral and central nervous system.
What are the 2 to 3 big issues in EEG that people are working on to solve today?
I think we still have to work on remaining relevant. I think we are relevant, but I think there's continuous education that needs to be done to make sure that people know that we are relevant. One of the big issues, I think, is what to do with all of the new data that's available, especially with long-term monitoring. If you're doing long-term monitoring from the cortex and you're recording with faster and faster sampling times, there are incredible amounts of data that are provided. And I think one reason that, and this was a couple of decades ago when they first started recording from grids for epilepsy, which was a wonderful technological improvement and much better than just doing the simple corticography in the operating room. When you think about the frequencies that those grids recorded from the brain, it was amazing. Because it was digital and it was only limited by how fast your machine could sample it. And then it was recorded for days, so you could see how all of these faster frequencies changed with waking and sleeping, and what were the normal fast frequencies in different conditions. Were there unusual frequencies that showed up before you had any seizure activity? Or I think there's a tremendous amount of information that could be that's hidden in there, but we aren't quite ready to get it out. It may just take an awful lot of. We may have to have some sort of computer analysis. As you know, my husband's a radio astronomer, and when they point a huge telescope at an object in the sky, they record an incredible amount of data, most of which they're not interested in. But then through computer processing, they can pull out very, very, very useful data about things that are part of galaxies or things outside our galaxies and so forth. So I think that kind of thing, that'll be coming. I mean, that's just working with the technology we have. And I think we just need to look at more new ways in which electrophysiologic testing can help patients. Are there any new disorders that are coming up that could be defined better with neurophysiology? I think there's going to be some work there, because I think there are a lot of things that we've not studied with electrophysiology. And for example, autism, how is that different from the normal brain? And as we can find finer and finer differences, we haven't really done much of anything with the physiology of with mental health diseases. Is that going to be an area in which, for example, the same as we made differences in types of epilepsy, are there perhaps physiologic changes that we can see with different kinds of mental health problems that would help us get exactly the right medication and treatment for those? I don't know, but I think we have a lot of tools, and I think there are a lot of things we haven't done yet.
What are the main areas of professional discussion or disagreement today?
I studied that question when you sent me these, and I don't think I'm active enough in the field to really know what's going on, because there's the usual, turf wars, and then there's worrying about how you're going to pay for things and so forth. So I don't really know where the field is going and what the problems are there.
What are you most proud of in your professional life?
I think any educational efforts that I did would be just clumped in with the things that I'm really proud of. As I mentioned, I was a clinical instructor for students. I've been a mentor and a trainer of colleagues in new procedures. I've been part of the team that through the decades has developed a lot of the educational products that ASAT has available. Of course, as you know, as a journal editor, the high point of my life, it's all been down from there, was getting our journal listed and indexed in Medline. I thought that was just a major feather in the cap, was to have a larger group recognize us as relevant and not just copying what the doctor's doing. That we were doing independent things on our own. Educational things that I produced when I was in Minnesota. Joanne Simser got a small grant from the state or somebody to produce some educational materials, and we put together a slide tape on the normal and abnormal anatomy and physiology of neonates. You probably recognize that title as being the title of the paper as it ended up in the journal after it had been a slide tape. Along with that slide tape, we had another slide tape that was EEG patterns. Now that one, it was brilliantly done. No, I was real proud of it, but I didn't. And it had really good material in it, but somehow it was never able to be copied very well, and the slides just were always too faint to see, and it never went anywhere. And there's some better materials have been put out by other people since then. So that one has fallen by the wayside. But the third part of that educational package was the video that we did on how to run an EEG on a neonate. And I'm still very proud of that, and I'm sorry that it's not being marketed more, because I think it's still extremely valid. We did use collodion. That may not be used on neonates much anymore, but it was an absolute miracle in that we could when we wrote the script for it, we had to write it. Our photographer would not take a single picture until he understood every word and phrase in the script. So it meant that it had to be written in such a way that everybody could understand it. And then we only had a baby for, I think, just an hour, maybe an hour and a half at most. And it was, of course, old technology. We had one camera sitting on top of my grass machine, pointed down at the paper as it went by, and the other camera was pointed at the baby's face, and we did split screen that way. And we had a baby that had a rough neonatal time. He had a shunt in place, and he was just about to go home. So he was at that time was a pretty much normal term baby. And it worked out magnificently that we got him down to the lab, got him hooked up, were able to demonstrate what things you might have to do as far as moving electrodes, pointed out what shunts look like under the skin. Maybe fussed while we were hooking him up, and when we let him alone, he drifted off and he went into all of the stages of sleep as he should have. He showed all of the mandatory patterns that he should have, and it's all right there on the tape. And I think I'm still very, very proud of that. I think that was really, really good.
Where do you see neurodiagnostics in 10 years?
That's another one in which I don't have a lot of information. I remember taught by Gerald Fenichel once. He's a pediatric neurologist from Vanderbilt, and the line that struck me was that no child should be started on an anticonvulsant without an EEG. I would like to have that be something that is really spread around, and I don't know that it is. I think we do have people learning new techniques. We're going to be we probably are going to have to look at the various technologies that are being used in other things. For example, all of the telemedicine things, I can see that becoming something very common, and we're already seeing that when people check in on what's happening in the operating room from the computer in their lab, that sort of thing, which is just miles ahead of the old telephone EEG. So I see that being something where you can get a lot of expertise in one place, being able to serve smaller places. I think there is enough interest in always looking at new things. I hope people, every time they do an ordinary study of whatever it is, whether it's a weird intraoperative case or whatever, that they're always looking for something odd that came up with this particular patient, and maybe this is something that we could do. There is still research being done in neurology on different things, and making sure that neurophysiology gets included in that, I think, is always helpful. For example, at Minnesota, this is just an example of how you can have weird collections of things come together to come up with a new use for neurophysiology. We had developed a technique. Actually, we had were copying some people in Utah who had done this. The new technology and recording should make it even better. But we were recording visual evoked potentials on people who were albinos, because albinos are known anatomically to have a different way that their visual tracts, the optic tracts, travel. And we were doing this test so that if you had people who were we had a whole family of albinos from Puerto Rico came up to be studied by our ophthalmology department, and then they would send them down to us to see whether or not they did or did not have these aberrant visual tracts. So there are a lot of just very strange things that you don't think about in everyday life that somebody's going to be studying that's going to pop up, and you think, I bet we could measure. Wonder how a person could measure that. Well, what would happen if, I think we can do that, and I think we're going to be continuing to do that in the future, because I think, again, going back to physiology, I think we're going to need to know, function. I think we're going to need to have ways to measure function, neurologic function in the future, and it's what things technology allows us to do and where people's imagination takes them.
What's the best piece of advice you've ever received?
Well, I was thinking about that, and I think the main thing that Margaret Schaefer taught me was that EEG is fun. And that to me has always stuck with me as just such an important thing. You're not going to get anywhere if it's just, you go in, you put the electrodes on, and you go out and have a cup of coffee and come in, take them, and boring. But if you're sort of one with the machine and and you're involved with that recording of whatever modality you're doing, it just makes it a real difference. Another story that doesn't really fit in there, but almost does, that some people have heard, and that was kind of the inspiration that I had to really stay in EEG, and that was when I was first doing EEG in Texas. A mother came in with her daughter, who was about 12, and she was a beautiful girl and bright, and the sort of child that was polite but would answer, and very alert and smart, and just the sort of daughter anybody would love to have. And there was something about the mother's attitude that I didn't quite understand at the time. But the daughter had a seizure, and so she'd come to have her EEG. And I ran the record, and then as I was taking the electrodes off, the mother, of course, wanted to know what it showed, and I gave her the usual line about I'm just a technologist, and of course the physician will tell you how that fits in with everything else. But there was something about her fear or whatever I could sense in her that made me go on to say that I can't give you an interpretation of it, but what I can tell you is that her EEG looks just about exactly the way mine did at her age. And since that time, I have gone on to have a completely normal life, graduate from college. I'm now happily married, plan to live a normal life. And she'd seen me working this incredibly complex machine, so I must have been a genius. And it was fascinating that I could almost see a physical cloud rise from that woman. Now, the kid didn't care. The kid wasn't scared at all. She was, she blacked out, and big deal. But the mother had no idea what was going to happen, and this precious girl was going to, as far as she knew, was going to be, permanently crippled and tied in a wheelchair and drooling. But then to be able to have this image that here's a perfectly competent, ordinary person who's got the same EEG as my daughter. And it was just, I thought, this is a good place to be. So that was one of the very kind of, I was in the field anyway, but it was one of the things that made me think this is a really good field to be in, and there's just so many ways that people can be helped one person at a time.
Great. Is there anyone else that in EEG you think we should talk to? Who should we be talking to?
Well, you probably have a list of everybody I know, and my thought was just go through the list of present and past ASSET and ABRET board members and just see who's been around, who's been doing different things. Because everybody, I think pretty much everybody who's been really active in the field in one way or another has ended up on one of those boards at some time or another.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
And so I think that's a good way to find people.
Okay.
That would be.
Okay, great.